The first time I saw her, she was gripping the hospital bed rail so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and she looked straight at me, a stranger who had simply come to visit a coworker down the hall, and said, "You. Yes, you. Come here. I need you to make me a promise before I die today. I want to pause right here, before I tell you what happened next, to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet miracles that happen when strangers choose to care for one another, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because we are building a community here that believes people can change, that love can arrive at the worst possible moment and still be real, and that even in the middle of grief, something beautiful can grow. Now let me tell you about the woman in that hospital bed, and about the man who was too afraid to walk away from a promise he never asked to make, because that man was me, and my name is Nathaniel Ashworth, and this is the story of how a dying woman's letter changed the rest of my life. I was 34 years old that spring, working as a physical therapist at Brookhaven Medical Center, a job I had chosen because I liked helping people get back on their feet, literally and figuratively, after the worst had already happened to them. I had my own quiet griefs tucked away, a marriage that ended 2 years earlier not because of any great betrayal but because of a slow erosion of two people who had simply stopped reaching for each other, and I had built a life that was small and careful, full of routines that kept me from feeling too much of anything. I visited my friend and colleague Marcus Webb on my lunch break that Tuesday because he had broken his ankle skateboarding with his teenage son, of all things, and he was recovering on the 3rd floor. The hallway was bright with afternoon sun pouring through the tall windows, the kind of golden daylight that makes even hospital corridors feel less sterile, and it was in that light that I passed a room with its door half open and heard a voice, thin but fierce, calling out to me. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and she was 61 years old, though the cancer had aged her further, hollowing her cheeks and stealing the color from her once auburn hair. She had oxygen tubing looped beneath her nose and an 4-pole beside her bed, and yet there was something in her eyes, a sharp, undimmed intelligence, that made it impossible to simply nod politely and walk on. I stepped into the doorway, uncertain, and she waved me closer with a hand that trembled slightly. "I've been watching people walk past this door for 3 days," she said, "and I have been waiting for someone with a kind face. You have a kind face. Sit down." I told her I wasn't a doctor, that I was just visiting a friend, but she waved that away too, as though it were the least important fact in the world. "I don't need a doctor," she said. "Doctors can't do what I need. I need someone honest." "Are you an honest man?" I said I tried to be. She studied me for a long moment, the way you study something you are about to trust with everything you have, and then she reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a sealed envelope, cream-colored and slightly worn at the corners as if it had been held many times before being hidden away again. "This is for my daughter," she said. "Her name is Josephine. Josephine Whitfield, though she goes by Jo. She doesn't know I'm here. She doesn't know about the cancer. She doesn't know about any of it, because 3 years ago we had a terrible fight, the kind of fight that breaks something in a family, and she walked out of my life and I let her, because I was too proud and too hurt to run after her. I have spent 3 years telling myself I would fix it tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and now I am out of tomorrows." Her voice cracked on that last word, and she pressed the envelope into my hands with a strength that startled me. "I need you to find her. I need you to give her this letter. And I need you to promise me on whatever you hold sacred, that you will not let her read it alone. Sit with her. However long it takes. However hard it gets. Don't let her read it alone." I remember staring down at that envelope, feeling the absurd weight of a request I had no business accepting, and yet something in her eyes, some desperate, motherly plea that transcended every rational objection I could raise, made me say yes before I had even fully decided to. I want you to imagine, for a moment, what it feels like to hold a dying stranger's last words to her estranged child. It felt like holding a small, breakable universe. Eleanor gripped my hand once more, thanked me with tears finally sliding down her hollow cheeks, and told me where I might find Josephine, a bakery on the east side of town called Hartley's, where she had heard, through a mutual friend, that her daughter had been working for the past year. She told me Josephine had her father's stubbornness and her own soft heart buried under years of hurt, and she begged me, one final time, not to let her read the letter alone. I promised her again. 3 days later, Eleanor Whitfield passed away in the early afternoon, sunlight still streaming through her window, her hand resting on a small framed photograph of a little girl with gap-toothed smile and ribbons in her hair, and when Marcus told me the news, something in my chest tightened with a grief I had no right to feel for a woman I had known for less than an hour, and yet I felt it anyway, because grief, real grief, does not ask permission before it moves in. I did not go to the bakery immediately. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the whole spine of this story, and the truth is that I was afraid. I told myself I was busy, that I needed to find the right words, that grief was too fresh and I should give it time to settle, but really I think I was afraid of the responsibility Eleanor had placed in my hands, afraid of walking into a stranger's life carrying news that would shatter her world in an instant. It took me 9 days to work up the courage, 9 days during which I carried that envelope in my jacket pocket everywhere I went, feeling its presence like a stone against my ribs. On the 10th day, a Saturday, with the morning sun bright and clear over the town, I finally walked into Hartley's bakery, the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread wrapping around me like a memory I didn't have, and I saw her behind the counter, a woman with dark blonde hair pulled back in a loose braid, flour dusted across her forearms, laughing at something a customer had said. Josephine Whitfield had her mother's sharp eyes, I noticed immediately, the same intelligent, searching quality, though hers were softened by a warmth Eleanor's illness had perhaps stolen away in those final days. She was maybe 29, with an easy, unguarded smile that made the whole bakery feel warmer, and watching her work, watching her tease an elderly customer about his order and gently correct a young employee's technique with the pastry bag, I felt an unexpected ache, imagining how little she knew about what I was about to bring into her life. When there was a lull in customers, I approached the counter, and she looked up at me with polite, professional cheer, asking what I would like. I told her my name, and I told her I needed to speak with her about something important, something personal, and I watched the cheer in her eyes flicker into confusion and then into a wary, defensive alertness that people develop when strangers approach them with serious faces and serious words. She agreed to take her break early, and we sat at a small table near the window, sunlight falling across the scratched wood surface, and I told her, as gently as I knew how, that I had met her mother in the hospital, that her mother had asked me to find her, and that her mother had passed away 9 days earlier. I watched something in Josephine's face crumble and rebuild itself in the span of a few seconds, watched her jaw tighten and her eyes go glassy, and she said, in a voice that tried very hard to sound unaffected and failed completely, "We weren't close." She wouldn't have wanted me there anyway. I told her that wasn't true, that in her final days her mother had spoken of nothing else, that she had spent her last conscious hours writing a letter meant only for her, and I placed the cream-colored envelope on the table between us. Josephine stared at it as though it might catch fire, her hands trembling in her lap, and she made no move to touch it. I explained, carefully, that her mother had made me promise something, that she should not read this letter alone, and I asked, with as much gentleness as I could summon, whether she would allow me to sit with her while she read it, whether now or whenever she felt ready. Josephine looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and something rawer, something that looked almost like hope, and she asked me why a stranger would care enough to keep such a promise to a woman he'd met for less than an hour. I didn't have a fully formed answer for her that day. I only told her that some promises feel too important to break, even when we don't understand why we made them, and that I intended to keep mine. She didn't read the letter that day. She asked me to leave it with her, and though every instinct told me to protect my promise, I understood that trust could not be forced, and I told her I would come back the following Saturday, same time, if she wanted company when she was ready, and if she wasn't, I would simply leave, no questions asked, no expectations. She nodded, tucked the envelope beneath her apron, and I walked out of that bakery uncertain whether I had done the right thing or made things infinitely worse. The following Saturday, I returned, half expecting her not to be there, half expecting the whole strange episode to dissolve into something we would both prefer to forget. But she was there, sitting at the same small table, the same envelope resting unopened in front of her, and when she saw me, relief passed over her face so plainly that it made my chest ache. She told me she hadn't been able to open it, that every time she tried, her hands shook too badly and she had to put it away, that she'd spent the week cycling between anger at her mother for waiting until death to reach out, and grief so heavy she could barely get out of bed for work. I sat across from her and told her there was no timeline for this kind of thing, that grief doesn't respect schedules, and that I would keep coming back for as long as it took, because I had made a promise and I intended to honor it. She looked at me for a long moment and asked, quietly, why I hadn't simply mailed the letter and been done with my obligation. I told her the truth, that some part of me had felt, from the very first moment Eleanor grabbed my sleeve in that hospital room, that this was not a task to be discharged quickly, but a trust to be carried carefully, and that I did not yet know why that mattered so much to me, only that it did. Over the following weeks, our Saturday meetings became a quiet ritual. We would sit at that same table by the window, the morning light shifting with the changing season, and we would talk, not about the letter at first, but about everything around it. Josephine told me about growing up as an only child to a mother who worked long hours as a hospital administrator, a woman who loved fiercely but expressed it through discipline and high expectations rather than softness, and about a father who had left when Josephine was 11, an absence that had hardened something between mother and daughter even as it should have drawn them closer. She told me about the argument that broke them, 3 years prior, a fight over Josephine's decision to leave a stable corporate job to pursue her passion for baking, a decision Eleanor had called reckless and irresponsible, words that cut deep enough that Josephine packed a bag that same night and didn't speak to her mother again. She told me she had thought about calling 100 times, had even dialed the number once and hung up before it rang, paralyzed by pride and old wounds that never fully closed. I found myself telling her things too, more than I had told anyone in the 2 years since my divorce. I told her about my ex-wife, Renata, and how our marriage had ended not in a dramatic collapse but in a slow, quiet withering, two people who loved each other in theory but had forgotten how to reach for each other in practice, until one day we looked at each other across the kitchen table and both understood, without saying it aloud, that we were staying together out of habit rather than hope. I told her about the guilt I still carried, wondering if I could have fought harder, tried longer, been someone different enough to save something that maybe had never been built to last. Josephine listened with the same careful attention she gave to a difficult customer or a finicky batch of dough, and I realized, somewhere in those early weeks, that I was not merely fulfilling a promise anymore. I was looking forward to Saturdays with an eagerness that had nothing to do with obligation. It was on the 6th Saturday, with autumn beginning to color the leaves outside the bakery window in soft golds and reds, that Josephine finally slid the envelope across the table toward me and asked if I would sit beside her, not across from her, while she opened it. I moved my chair around, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and I felt the weight of the moment settle over both of us like a held breath. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal, and she unfolded 3 pages of handwriting, elegant but shaky in places where illness had clearly stolen some of the strength from Eleanor's grip. She began to read silently at first, her eyes moving across the lines, her breath catching, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began reading aloud, as though she needed to hear the words spoken into the world to believe they were real. Eleanor had written that she was sorry, not simply for the argument that ended their relationship, but for every year before it in which she had shown love through correction rather than acceptance, for every time she had let her own fear of Josephine repeating her own mistakes translate into criticism instead of encouragement. She wrote that after Josephine's father left, she had convinced herself that the only way to protect her daughter from a world that had already hurt them both was to build her into someone unbreakable, someone who would never depend on anyone else for happiness or security, and that in trying to make her strong, she had forgotten to make her feel loved simply for existing. She wrote about watching Josephine grow into a woman who was kind in ways Eleanor herself had never learned to be, and how proud that made her, even when pride was buried beneath sharp words and stubborn silence. She wrote that the bakery, the very thing she had called reckless, was in fact the bravest thing she had ever seen her daughter do, choosing joy over safety, and that she deeply regretted never once saying so. Josephine's voice broke completely somewhere in the second page, and I reached over without thinking and took her hand, and she gripped it back so tightly it almost hurt, and she kept reading through tears that fell freely onto the paper, blurring some of the ink. Eleanor's final paragraph was the hardest, and Josephine had to stop twice to catch her breath before finishing it. Her mother had written that she did not expect forgiveness, that she understood if the wound was too deep to heal even now, but that she needed Josephine to know she had spent every day of her illness thinking not of her own fear of dying, but of the fear that her daughter would spend the rest of her life believing she had not been loved enough, when in truth she had been loved entirely, imperfectly, but entirely, from the moment she was born until the moment Eleanor's heart stopped beating. The letter ended with a simple request, that Josephine forgive herself for the years of silence as much as she might, in time, forgive her mother, because guilt was a poison that would only rot the beautiful life Eleanor so desperately wanted her daughter to keep building. When Josephine finished reading, she folded into herself, sobbing in a way that seemed to release years of held tension all at once, and I did the only thing I knew to do, which was to stay, exactly as I had promised, my arm around her shoulders, letting her grief pour out without trying to fix it or rush it or explain it away. We sat like that for a long time, the bakery humming quietly around us, other patrons giving us a respectful, unspoken privacy, until her breathing steadied and she finally looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked, in a small voice, whether I thought her mother had really meant every word. I told her that people rarely find the strength to write such raw honesty unless it comes from the deepest, truest part of themselves, and that in my experience, dying strips away everything except what actually matters, leaving only truth behind. She nodded slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life, that she wished she had known her mother loved her that much while there was still time to say it back. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between Josephine and me, subtle at first, the way morning light changes almost imperceptibly before you suddenly notice the whole sky has brightened. Our Saturday meetings, no longer bound by any promise or obligation, continued anyway, because neither of us wanted them to stop. We talked about her mother, yes, but also about small, ordinary things, her favorite childhood books, my clumsy attempts at cooking anything beyond simple staples, the stray cat she had started feeding behind the bakery that she swore she wasn't going to adopt and then, within a month, absolutely did adopt and named Biscuit. I found myself thinking about her during the week, wondering how she was managing the grief that came in waves, wondering if she'd slept, wondering what she'd think of some small observation I'd made during my workday. I recognized the feeling for what it was long before I admitted it out loud, because admitting it felt like a betrayal of the strange, sacred circumstances that had brought us together, as though falling in love with the daughter of a woman whose dying wish I had promised to honor was somehow taking advantage of grief rather than growing alongside it. It was Josephine, in fact, who said it first, on a bright Saturday morning in early winter, nearly 4 months after Eleanor's death, snow dusting the windowsill outside while we sat with cups of coffee going cold between us. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, something searching and brave all at once, and she said that she had been trying for weeks to figure out whether what she felt for me was simply gratitude, simply the natural attachment that forms towards someone who helps you through the worst grief of your life, or whether it was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with her mother's letter and everything to do with who I was as a person. She said she had finally decided it didn't matter how it started, because however it started, what she felt now, sitting across from me, was real, and she was tired of being afraid to say things out loud after everything her mother's letter had taught her about the cost of silence. I remember my heart pounding as she spoke, remember the strange, dizzying relief of hearing someone name the thing I had been too afraid to name myself, and I told her that I felt exactly the same way, that somewhere between the 9th Saturday and this one, my sense of obligation had quietly transformed into something I hadn't planned for and couldn't imagine my life without. I want to be honest with you about what came next, because this is not a story where everything suddenly became easy. Falling in love with Josephine did not erase the complicated feelings either of us carried. There were nights, and I mean evenings before nightfall mostly, long conversations that stretched into early dusk, where Josephine would suddenly grow quiet and distant, gripped by a fresh wave of grief that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the mother she would never get to properly reconcile with in person, never get to hug, never get to introduce me to as anything other than a story told after the fact. There were days she would cancel our plans entirely, telling me she needed to be alone with her thoughts, and I learned, slowly, that loving someone through grief means learning the difference between giving space and disappearing, between showing up and smothering, and I made mistakes along the way, pushing too hard some days, retreating too far on others, learning her rhythms the way you learn to navigate any unfamiliar, precious terrain. There was one particular afternoon, about 6 months after we had become a couple, when Josephine nearly ended things between us entirely, not because she had stopped caring, but because guilt had crept back in with a vengeance. We had been sitting in the small park near her apartment, sunlight filtering through bare spring branches not yet fully leafed, and she suddenly turned to me and said she couldn't do this anymore, that every time she felt happy with me, a voice in her head told her she didn't deserve happiness, not after abandoning her mother for 3 years, not after only reconciling through a letter delivered by a stranger because she'd been too proud to pick up a phone while there was still time. She said she felt like she was betraying her mother's memory by building a life, a joyful life, out of the very tragedy that had finally forced them to reconcile, as though her happiness was somehow purchased with her mother's death. I understood, in that moment, that this was the real work of love, not the easy Saturdays with coffee and quiet conversation, but showing up fully for someone in the moment they most wanted to push you away. I told her, sitting on that park bench with the wind stirring the new spring grass around our feet, that her mother's entire letter had been about exactly this fear, that Eleanor had begged her, explicitly, not to let guilt rot the beautiful life she was capable of building, and that choosing to be happy now was not a betrayal of her mother's memory but the truest possible honoring of it. I told her that grief and joy were not opposites fighting for the same space in a person's heart, that they could coexist, that missing her mother fiercely and loving fully were not contradictions but two honest expressions of the same capacity to feel deeply. I told her I wasn't going anywhere, that I understood grief moved in unpredictable tides and I intended to stay through every single one of them, not because I had promised her mother anything anymore, that debt had long since been paid, but because I had chosen her, entirely and separately, for exactly who she was becoming through all of this. She cried again that day, but differently than before, and when she finally looked up at me, something in her face had settled, some argument she'd been having with herself finally resolved, and she said, quietly, that she believed me, and that she wanted to try, really try, to let herself be happy without apology. From that day forward, something between us deepened in a way that felt less like new love and more like something being built to last, brick by careful brick. Josephine began speaking of her mother with more warmth and bitterness, sharing stories that had nothing to do with the argument that had divided them, memories from childhood she'd buried under years of resentment, like the time Eleanor had stayed up 3 straight nights sewing an elaborate Halloween costume by hand because young Josephine had changed her mind about wanting to be a butterfly instead of a witch 2 days before the holiday, or the way Eleanor used to hum old jazz standards while cooking Sunday dinners, off-key but full of unself-conscious joy. She began visiting her mother's grave regularly, something she'd avoided in the early months, and she asked me to come with her the first time, and I stood beside her in the quiet cemetery, autumn leaves scattered across the grass in the bright afternoon sun, as she spoke aloud to a headstone for the first time since the funeral, telling her mother about the bakery's growing success, about the new sourdough recipe she'd perfected, and about me, telling Eleanor, with a small, tearful smile, that she thought her mother would have liked me, would have approved, even grudgingly, of the way I made her laugh. It was nearly a year after Eleanor's death, on a warm afternoon in early summer with sunlight pouring generously across the bakery's little outdoor seating area, that Josephine told me she wanted to expand Hartley's, to open a second location on the west side of town, something she'd dreamed about for years but never had the confidence or the capital to pursue alone. I told her I believed in her completely, and together we spent the following months navigating loan applications and lease negotiations and renovation headaches, learning to build something together the way you learn any new skill, clumsily at first, then with growing confidence. I remember the day the second Hartley's bakery opened, watching Josephine stand behind a new counter in a space entirely her own creation, greeting customers with the same easy warmth I'd first noticed the day I walked in carrying her mother's letter, and I felt an overwhelming, humbling gratitude for the strange, sorrowful, beautiful chain of events that had led me there. She had decided, in the weeks before the opening, to hang a small framed photograph near the register, the same picture of a gap-toothed little girl with ribbons in her hair that Eleanor had kept beside her hospital bed, and beneath it, a small brass plaque that read simply, "For my mother, who taught me, even in her last letter, that it is never too late to say I love you." I proposed to Josephine on a bright autumn afternoon nearly 2 years after Eleanor's death, in the same small park where she had once told me she couldn't bear the guilt of her own happiness, the same bare branches now full and gold with turning leaves, sunlight scattering warm light across the path where we had first learned to fight for each other rather than retreat. I got down on one knee, my hands trembling nearly as much as Eleanor's had trembled the day she first pressed that envelope into my palm, and I told Josephine that I had come into her life carrying someone else's final words, but that I intended to spend the rest of my life writing new words alongside her, ones we would get to read together, out loud, for as long as we both lived. She said yes before I even finished the question, laughing and crying at once, and when I slipped the ring onto her finger, she told me that she could feel her mother there with us, in the sunlight, in the rustling leaves, in the impossible, unlikely happiness neither of us could have predicted the day we first sat across from each other at that small table by the bakery window. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony held in that same park, surrounded by close friends and family, Marcus Webb standing beside me as my best man, still occasionally teasing me about the ankle he broke that started this entire unlikely chain of events. Josephine asked, during the ceremony, for a moment of silence to honor her mother, and in that quiet pause, standing beneath a canopy of blossoming trees with warm spring sunlight falling over the small gathered crowd, I watched her close her eyes and smile softly, as though she were finally, fully at peace, not because the grief had disappeared, grief like that never fully disappears, but because she had learned, through her mother's final letter and through the strange gift of a stranger who refused to let her carry it alone, that love and loss could live together inside the same heart without one destroying the other. If this story has touched your heart even a little, I want you to take a moment before it ends and think about the people in your own life you haven't spoken to in far too long, the apologies you've been meaning to make, the love you've been meaning to say out loud, because Eleanor Whitfield taught me, more than anyone else I have ever known, that we rarely get to choose the moment when it becomes too late, and that the words we're most afraid to say are usually exactly the ones the people we love need most to hear. Before you go, I would love for you to leave a comment below sharing what this story stirred in you, whether it reminded you of someone you need to forgive, someone you need to call, or simply the belief that it is never truly too late to make things right while there is still time left to try, because that is the whole heart of why this story matters. And if you believe, as I do now, that kindness given freely to strangers can quietly reshape entire lives, that forgiveness is a gift we give as much to ourselves as to others, and that second chances are real and worth fighting for, then please like this video, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story from our family here, because we believe, together, that even in our darkest, most uncertain hospital rooms, love still finds a way to write itself into the rest of our lives. Today, Josephine and I run both locations of Hartley's Bakery together, and we've hung Eleanor's photograph in the new location too, right beside the register where the morning light catches it best, and every single day, in that soft, forgiving daylight, I am reminded that a dying woman's simple request, "Don't let her read it alone," became the doorway through which the rest of my life walked in, uninvited and unexpected, and utterly, completely worth it.